Lord, I lift your name on high. Lord, I lift your name on high. Lord, I love to sing your praises. Lord, I love to sing your praises. I'm so glad you're in my life. I'm so glad you're in my life. I'm so glad you came to save us.
How many of you are scared? Thank you, Amelia, for being honest. How many of you are apprehensive? How many of you have trepidation? How many have fear? I already did that one, didn't I? But I thought if I phrased it a little different way, people would say something different. As we drove down here this morning, I noticed, and I purposely went by several churches. There's a large church that is merged not very far from our house, close to the corner of Devonshire and Mason. And on Sunday mornings, they usually have parking attendants, have individuals directing for parking spaces. They had no cars in their parking lot. Coming down by the Catholic Church, the corner of Mason and Lassen, maybe there were 15 cars in there. Normally it's packed to the gills in the parking lot, and then individuals parking on both Mason and Lassen. Then went over to Winnetka to come down. The Christian church at the corner of Winnetka and, Plummer? Parthenia? There were maybe 7 cars in the parking lot. Normally they're packed. Coming down even further, down to the church across the street from the park, 5 cars. Came a little bit further down, the community church, 3 cars. People are scared. They have fear, they have trepidation. And it's fear of the unknown, and unfortunately, fear begins to permeate. But in all honesty, life is full of suffering. Life is full of uncertainty. And life sometimes seems like it's just going to squash us. And people are worried over things now that they never would have been worried about before. Who would have ever thought in this country there would be toilet paper riots? And it's funny if it weren't so pathetic. Why have people bought into the concept of you need bottled water? But yet they have, and they're buying it by the caseloads. In order to get water that's potable, that's drinkable, you turn on a faucet. You have things at home you can fill water in if you're that concerned. But yet people are panicked. They're fearful. As Christians, we suffer. And we do suffer uniquely. Peter would write back in the first letter that he would pen, in the first chapter. And the first 6 verses, he's writing to a group of people that are dispirited, that are concerned, that have trepidation, that have fear. And it is fear of the known and fear of the unknown. Many of us that are here have gone through any number of different things. We went through the earthquake here in 94, and that was fearful. We went through the riots in 92, and that was fearful. We've gone through any number of different searches and situations that have been fearful. September 11th, fearful. But now we are faced with another situation. But it is again coming back to just what the Bible teaches and what the scriptures seem to echo. Peter writes in 1 Peter, the first chapter, verse 6, "In this you greatly rejoice, even though now, for a little while, if necessary, you have been distressed by various trials, that the proof of your faith, being more precious than gold, which is perishable, even though tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ." We know we have challenges. We know that life is kind of hovering over us, we think right now, ready to just squash us. But it's been that way for the child of God, and in all honesty, for mankind since the very inception. Back when you look at the teaching in the Sermon on the Mount by Jesus, he points out some things for our consideration. Because what we see in Matthew, the 6th chapter, verse 25, for this reason I say to you, do not be anxious for your life, as to what you shall eat or what you shall drink, or nor for your body, as to what you shall put on it. Is not life more than food, and the body than clothing? And the answer comes back a resounding yes. More to life than all of that. Then Jesus goes on to say, and which one of you, by being anxious, can add a single cubit to lifespan? He then concludes this section in the Sermon on the Mount in verse 33. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. Well, we know that life is filled with anxious moments. We know as the next few days begin to escalate, we know that we're going to be inundated with news of additional cases of COVID-19. We know that. We know that it's going to escalate, and we're going to do any number of projections in our mind. But realize that we are not unique. That we are not in any way to view ourselves as alienated from these things. But as Dan said in his prayer earlier, we are to keep it in perspective. Because we, above all people, realize that we have a relationship with the God of heaven that should sustain us, that should elevate us, that should give us hope and direction. Amen. We know that in life there are going to be things we cannot control. And this is one of them. We do what we can do. And we apply the principles that we see even exhibited back in the Old Testament. 2 weeks ago, Linda was reading, as she is wont to do. She gets up early in the morning, sits in my office area at the house, and reads. And we realize that area is quiet. And so she's reading. And I come out there and I sit down, and she says, she says, it's amazing all the laws that they had relative to hygiene and just how applicable they are today. And you look back at them and you see the advanced wisdom that the children of Israel had because God was giving them direction. And basically what God was saying, I've given you a spiritual law, yes. But I've also given you laws that is going to protect you from contamination in a physical regards. So be mindful of them, to observe to do all of them, not just part, but indeed all of those things. Go back into 1 Peter. In that first chapter, Peter writes, verse 4, to obtain an inheritance which is imperishable and undefiled and will not fade away, reserved in heaven for you, who are protected by the power of God through faith for salvation, ready to be revealed in the last time. Well, what we're trying to see very clearly is just exactly what it is that we're going to have to endure. I look at that now in hindsight, that yellow probably doesn't show up real greatly. But Linda Miller is why she's got it on her little tablet so she can see it a little bit better. But anyways, let's just press on with what we know. There is this aspect of, as Christians, we're going to suffer uniquely. And why shouldn't we? After all, didn't Christ suffer? And yes, he did. Peter even goes in and talks about the suffering of Christ. And he talks about to the degree that Christ suffered. We know that Stephen suffered. If you look back at Acts, the 6th chapter and 7th chapter, and you realize that in those indications, that he was a man that went through a tremendous amount of suffering, of anxiety and anguish. Why? The answer is because he was a child of God. So as we as Christians look at it, we know there are things that we face universally with other of mankind, which we'll talk about in a moment. But as Christians, there is this additional suffering that we are going to face. In fact, Paul would write, for all who desire to live godly will face persecution. We know that. We understand it. That's seen back in 2 Timothy, the 3rd chapter, and verse 12. Now, Peter writes in 1 Peter 4 and verse 15 about the joy of salvation and the fact that we have to endure trials and suffering, and that this trial and suffering has been endured by countless others, individuals down through time who have endured so much. But notice his exact words. 1 Peter 4, verse 15. By no means let any of you suffer as a murderer, or a thief, or an evildoer, or a troublesome meddler. But if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not feel ashamed, but in that name let him glorify God. Well, not only does Peter talk about the suffering and those that are scattered abroad because of the persecution that was being exacted on the church in the first century, but James does well. And he talks about, consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials. Then he goes on talking about, for this will produce endurance. You're going to face different things, different challenges, different difficulties that are going to be there and brought before us. But on top of that, you're going to have to face the challenges of life in general. And that's what we're dealing with right now. It is amazing what a week makes. Last Sunday morning, the lesson was dealing with the idea of the rise of women taking authority within the body of Christ, and how so many are sitting back with a laissez-faire approach to it, and how we need to be more proactive. We talked about the urgency of it. Now, a week later, we're talking about things that life has introduced to us, and that is the thoughts and the danger that hangs over us. And it is really, no pun intended, but it is really being trumped up in many ways. We know that in life we're going to face difficulties. We know that in life we're going to face situations like this. We know that. But we also know in life that there are any number of issues that life presents to us. Go back into the book of Job. And we're going to go into the 14th chapter. And in that 14th chapter, drop down into the 5th verse. And the discussions between Job and his friends has not gone on very long, but this is brought out in that 14th chapter. And note what's found. Since his days are determined, the number of his months is with thee, and his limits thou hast set, that he cannot pass. So what's he talking about? What's he trying to drive at? If you go back into the very first verse, man who is born of woman is short-lived and full of turmoil. So that's what he's saying, that in this life we're going to have challenges. We're going to have difficulties. We're going to have things that press on us. Go back a little bit further into the book of Ecclesiastes, into the 3rd chapter, and look at verse 2. A time to give birth, a time to die, a time to plant, and time to uproot what is planted. We know that at some point death is going to visit us all. Now, it is troublesome anytime anyone dies. My heart goes out to all those individuals in the retirement home in Kirkland, Washington. I mean, just my mind can only fathom just a little bit of what went on. Because see, what had happened there is that they had a party on what the Catholics had determined is Ash Wednesday. And they invited an individual into the facility. And he was from the Catholic Church, and I'm not blaming this on the Catholics at all. Do not think that. But he is invited in, and he puts the ashes on the individual's foreheads. And they're having this party that goes on involving all the people. A few days before, they had made hats to wear for the party. They're all interacting. Their closeness is clearly evident. However, days before, according to the article that I read not too long ago, staff there began to see a rise in infection. And so members of the staff started wearing masks. But yet, the virus spread through the facility. Dozens of lives were lost. What a difference just a few days made. When you look at the death toll in the United States, well over half of it, well over, as it stands right now, is attributed to that one facility. Devastating. But yet we know that there are going to be more. Things are going to escalate. Fear is going to run rampant. And concern is going to be there. Concern to such a degree that my doctors earlier this week each sent me emails, my cardiologist and my general practitioner, and said, please, 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 must not want to see me anymore, whatever. But please take care of yourself. Don't go out unless it's absolutely necessary. And if you do, stay 6 feet away from people. And if you have to get any closer, don't get closer than 3 feet. I told them, Leo, I'll do that. Mike, I'll do that. I'm on first name basis with my doctor, so that's why Leo and Mike. But I'll do that. I'll encourage other people to do it. But you're going to hear more and more of that. But the question comes back that eventually this too will pass. In time, it'll wander into the back of our minds, as did the earthquake, as did September 11th, as did the riots, and all the other things we faced. And then we come back to the harsh reality of the suffering of everyday life. All of us will suffer pain. It breaks my heart that Susan Odorizzi has so much pain, that Linda Miller struggles with pain, and others do as well. We know that illness is going to creep in. We know that there are cancers. Austin's father struggles with cancer, though some of the markers from what I hear are a little bit more encouraging. That's a reason to celebrate. We pray that that continues. People go through depression. People have accidents. Just a couple of weeks ago, Johnny Binder had an accident. Set her back. Others have accidents. You have financial setbacks. You have workplace setbacks. You have setbacks that you have to deal with. Disease is rampant. Why? Well, go back to Genesis and you see why. We're not designed to live forever. And it's because of sin that entered into the world that man has to face death. Amen. But we know that disease is going to be there. We know that people are going to have money issues. Right now, that seems to be forefront. And it's kind of amazing when you think of what people do for people. Sports is looked at as kind of like Toys R Us for society. But I'm really proud of the individuals in the sports industry, because all the individuals that are the support group, the people that work in the stadiums, that clean and do all those things, that get people to their seats, they're not going to have an income. And so the sports figures have started collecting money, hundreds and hundreds of thousands from each and every one, to put into a common fund to help pay for those people. That's great for the short term. But see, suffering is that which we go through constantly. And so day by day, people are going to have money issues. People are going to have anguish. People are going to have personality disorders. Not everybody is as well balanced as I am. It's a fact you've got to figure out. So there are going to be personality disorders. I mean, you've really been blessed to know me, right? And I speak in jest, but we all have personalities. And there are some that are challenging. But we're going to have to deal with people. People are going to have family concerns. And we can go on and on and on. And those are things with which we suffer and struggle. But what is so amazing, even as you stay there in the book of Ecclesiastes, you turn over to the 7th chapter and look at verse 15. And notice what Solomon writes there. I've seen everything during my lifetime of futility. There is a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness. There is a wicked man who prolongs his life in his wickedness. There's going to be a lot of things that happen that we don't understand. And then we're going to sit back and say, why? Why is God doing this? Why would God do this? And the answer is, you can't blame God. And there are a lot of people who would like to blame God. Go into the book of James in the New Testament. And in James, I think you can see it on the overhead, it's into the 1st chapter, and in that 1st chapter, drop down to the 12th verse. Blessed is the man who perseveres under trial, for once he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I'm being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. See, that was part of the problem with Job. And that was part of the problem with Job's friends. Why is God doing this to him? And it wasn't God. Go to 1 Peter, into the 5th chapter, and go down at verse 8. Be of sober spirit. Be on the alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls about like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. He's going around like a roaring lion. And it's not God who's doing it, it's Satan. I've been doing some recreational reading recently, and I kind of was captivated, and this is Jacob Mashingeti's fault, but I was kind of captivated to know more about the history of Rhodesia, now known as Zimbabwe. And to know about the Civil War and the violence that was accorded, and that was happening when you were young, right? And you had to be really young. Maybe not so young because you're old. So, but anyways, but the violence that was accorded and the rampantness, that the discord that went through that country. And then I remember Joseph, not Joseph of the Bible, but Joseph Kafka, who attended here. He's not a member of the church, but he attended with us for several years. And Joseph was from Tanzania. And Joseph would talk about the various things that he went through in his life, and how his father was a farmer, and that if any animal came and destroyed any of the flock, Joseph had to track it down, kill it, and bring it back and prove to his father. And Joseph, rather than going out and hunting after the fact, what Joseph started doing was staying with the flock. And that when he would hear the roar of a lion, or the guttural groan of a leopard or a big bird, a cat of prey, he would immediately get his senses alerted. And he would try to stave off any destruction before it happened. Well, God said, it's not me that's doing it. And you need to be on the alert and watchful and realize that when these times come, they are not emanating from me. If you go back into the book of Hebrews in the 11th chapter, and verse 32 and following, for time will fail me, is what the writer said. If I tell of Gideon, of Barak, of Japhet, and so on. And talking about individuals who went through a lot of suffering, of anguish and grief. And it wasn't God who was doing it. But yet the appeal is, stay faithful. Stay focused. Realize that something better is to come. And that's across all of mankind. Now, true, the heroes of faith, they faced it differently. We're going to get to that in a moment. But what Jacob went through and the whole nation of Rhodesia went through, that was across the board. What Tanzania has gone through and what Joseph experienced as a young lad, that was seen across everything. That wasn't because they were Christians or not. Now, there might have been additional pressure put on for those that were Christians, but it was just life. We're not being singled out because we're Christians. And it really, really bothers me when individuals from whatever flavor, whatever stripe of society wants to come along and say, well, this is because of. No, you don't do that. We're in this all together. And by having our faith, our confidence, our trust in God, we can get through this. Now, does that mean that some in the household of faith are not going to get sick? No, absolutely not. Because we know that some will. We know that some are going to die as a result of it. It's a given. Do I want to be one of those? No. I don't want everybody, singing When the Saints Go Marching In at a party at some restaurant for me. See, that's really what I want. I don't want any memorial. Go somewhere and have a big party or whatever. He's gone. He's gone. He's gone. And I don't mean to be gallows humor. But I want us to know that it is part and parcel of life. And that we lean on one another more at this time. Amen. And that we lean on God more at this time. Amen. And we respect what people are going through emotionally and what they may be dealing with spiritually. It is a time for us to join together. And as Dan indicated in his prayer, it might even be a time that we can utilize this to let others know why we feel the way that we do. And it's because of that hope and that trust we have in God. So the heroes of faith, they remained locked in through whatever life dealt to them. And that is the same way that we have to be. But there is an additional part as Christians we need to realize. Human suffering is universal. It is universal in as much as it rains on the righteous and unrighteous. Amen. The earthquake happens and it affects everybody. The devastation of drought impacts all. It is this great trickle-down effect that touches everything and everyone. However, when Peter writes, when James writes, and they're talking specifically to Christians, they're talking about something that is unique only to Christians. And that is something that we need to hold on to as well. Amen. Because as Christians, we face persecution. We know that. All who desire to live godly will face persecution. Again, Paul's writing in his last letter to Timothy. We know that. We can go back and look at the persecution that Paul faced and endured. Go into the book of 2 Corinthians, the 11th chapter. You can see it. 5 times I received from the Jews, 39 lashes. Stone, night and a day have I spent in the deep. Frequent journeys and dangers from rivers, dangers from countrymen, dangers on the highway. Apart from such external things, there is daily pressure upon me for all the churches. So Paul said, I've endured all these things, separate and apart from the fact that my eyesight's not what it should be. Separate and apart from the fact that all the other rigors of human life I've dealt with. But I have these additionally. Well, as Christians, we're going to face those. Our brethren in China cannot meet in a collective as we do. It is outlawed. In other places in the world, they cannot meet as we meet. And they face intense persecution. And so we sit here and we have the comfort of this building, the comfort of one another, and we realize sometimes how really fortunate we are. So there's going to be persecution. There's going to be mental anguish we face. We're going to be ostracized. It's going to happen. People are going to say, well, how can you be so educated and still be a Christian? And I've had that happen to me. At colleges where I've taught, they go, well, you're a doctor, right? Yeah, I hold a PhD. How can you be a PhD and be a preacher too? Aren't they in opposition to one another? I mean, you're smart enough to know. Yeah, you're right, I'm smart enough to know that I can be both a PhD and a preacher and a Christian, because one does not negate the other. Amen. But yet in society, if you're a Christian, you're looked upon a little bit lower. Oh, how could you believe that drivel? How could you not believe it? It has been proven time and time again to be truth. But there's the mental anguish. There's also the loss of friends. We all need friends. And that's a struggle. Because when you begin to take a stand for truth, friends begin to take a holiday. You're going to lose relatives. You're going to face scorn and ridicule. Those things are challenging. Those things test our mettle. Those are the things, in part, of what suffering as a Christian is all about. Notice what Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 4 and verse 13. We become as the scum of the world, the dregs of all things, even until now. Now, do you know what the dregs are? The dregs are the bottom of the barrel. I've gotten into a habit of eating, it's not really a habit, but I've got a new go-to for snacking at night. And it is this huge bag of popcorn. It's not that big, it's probably that big. I wish it was that big. But it was $5. And it's supposed to be flavored with real butter. But you can't eat all the way to the bottom, because you get down there and you get to the dregs of the popcorn, the kernels. You got to chuck it out. Well, in the dregs of a barrel, you get down to that which is just not worth dealing with. You scrape it out in order to use the barrel again. It is the dregs, the bottom of the barrel. He said Paul said that's the way the world looks at us. We are the scum of the world. The scum is that which collects on the top. That's what you take off, that mother that collects there as it goes through the process of souring. Okay, we're the scum and we're the dregs. That's the way the world looks at us. Well, as Christians, we face those things. We face the things that everybody else faces, but we also face things that the rest of the world doesn't face. But as James said, consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials. Peter would talk in 1 Peter 5 and verse 10. He would say, and while you have suffered for a little while, the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself perfect, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. Amen. That's what I want. That's why I endure all these things. Because I know that in the end, it is going to be well worth it. Flip back into 1 Corinthians, the 4th chapter, and this will be the last passage we'll look at. But back in 1 Corinthians, 4th chapter, 2 Corinthians, the 4th chapter. And look at verse 16. Therefore, we do not lose heart. Okay, stop. He's talking to Christians and says, look, all the world may be crumbling around us for any number of reasons, whether it be something that all of mankind faces or something that we alone face. We don't lose heart. But though our outer man is decaying, yet our inner man is being renewed day by day. Now, verse 17, for momentary, light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comprehension. Amen. What we have waiting for us is far beyond comprehension. We can endure. We can overcome. And we can remain focused, alive, and directed the way that God would have us and want us to be. I know I said that the last passage was the last one we're going to look at. So I'm only going to direct you to read what the last passage is on the overhead. James 4 and verse 14. Because that's truly, we don't know what a day will bring. And so we need to have that confidence, that strength, that directive onto the God of heaven. And if you're here this morning and that is not where you're at, then by all means, we would love to assist you to get there. I know they talk about social distancing right now. But if you need to obey the gospel, forget social distancing. We'll be more than happy to assist you in your rendering obedience to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And the only way to do that is by being buried in the waters of baptism for the remission of your sins. If you need the prayers of the congregation for strength or encouragement after having put on Christ in the waters of baptism, we're more than happy to assist you. Our hope, our direction is heaven. And we know that by banding together, overcoming whatever may face us, and remaining focused, that realization will be ours. Jesus.